What would you do if your own children took the house, the savings, and everything you owned, and left you with nothing but an abandoned vineyard nobody wanted? At 72 years old, Eleanor Brooks believed she had lost everything after her husband's death. But hidden beneath her late father's forgotten vineyard in the hills of Montana was a secret buried for more than half a century. What she discovered would uncover a family mystery worth millions, expose the true hearts of those around her, and change an entire community forever. And before this story is over, you'll see how God can turn what the world calls worthless into an unexpected blessing. A cool autumn wind drifted across the rolling hills west of Missoula, Montana. Golden leaves danced through the air beneath a pale gray sky, while distant mountains stood quietly beneath gathering clouds. Eleanor Brooks stood alone beside her husband's grave long after everyone else had left. The cemetery had fallen silent except for the soft rustling of cottonwood trees and the occasional cry of a distant crow. At 72 years old, Eleanor remained a graceful woman despite the weight of time. She stood nearly 5 feet 8 inches tall with a slender frame, shoulder-length silver hair that still carried traces of the rich chestnut color of her youth, and gentle hazel eyes that had always reflected kindness before sorrow settled inside them. Her skin was lightly weathered from decades spent outdoors, and her calm voice often made others feel safe. Yet today, there was no calmness inside her. Robert Brooks was gone. For 49 years, Robert had been her partner, protector, and closest friend. He had been a tall man with broad shoulders, thick white hair, and a square jaw softened by an easy smile. Throughout his life, Robert built a successful transportation company that expanded across Montana and neighboring states. While many businessmen chased prestige, Robert cared more about stability. He wanted security for his family. Eleanor often admired his determination, even when it consumed long hours and endless travel. Now the house felt empty without him. The mornings felt longer, and every room seemed haunted by memories. 3 weeks after the funeral, Eleanor found herself sitting inside the spacious family home overlooking Flathead Lake. The large windows revealed sparkling blue water beneath the autumn sky, but she barely noticed. Across from her sat her son and daughter. Michael Brooks, 50 years old, had inherited much of Robert's physical presence. He stood over 6 feet tall with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, a strong jawline, and sharp blue eyes that often appeared calculating. Years spent working in corporate finance had taught him to view life through numbers, investments, and opportunities. Since his father's death, he seemed unusually focused on practical matters. Beside him sat Jennifer Brooks, 46 years old. Unlike her brother, Jennifer possessed a polished elegance. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, her makeup flawless, and her expensive clothing reflected the affluent lifestyle she enjoyed in Seattle. She worked as a real estate broker and had developed a reputation for always knowing how to negotiate the best deal. Unfortunately, that same trait sometimes made her appear cold without realizing it. Stacks of paperwork covered the dining room table. Lawyers had already prepared most of the documents. The discussion moved quickly. Too quickly. The lake house, the investment portfolios, the transportation company shares, the retirement accounts, the luxury vehicles. Everything seemed assigned a value. Everything seemed divided. Eleanor sat quietly throughout most of the meeting. Part of her understood the necessity of organizing the estate. Another part felt as though strangers were dismantling nearly 50 years of her life one document at a time. Then one final property appeared. Michael glanced at the paperwork and frowned. The vineyard. Jennifer immediately shook her head. No. Michael laughed softly. Definitely not. Eleanor looked up. The property consisted of 80 acres of abandoned vineyard land located on a remote hillside nearly 2 hours west of Missoula. The vineyard had originally belonged to Eleanor's father, Samuel Carter, before Robert purchased it decades earlier to keep it within the family. Once known for producing exceptional grapes, the land had gradually fallen into neglect after Samuel's death. No crops had been harvested there for over 20 years. Most of the vines had died. The irrigation systems had collapsed. Locals referred to it as Dead Hill Vineyard. Some simply called it the Dead Land. Michael pushed the document across the table. You can have that one. Jennifer nodded immediately. It probably costs more to maintain than it's worth. Neither sibling showed the slightest interest. To them, it was useless, a burden, an inconvenience. Eleanor stared at the property description. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. She was 10 years old, running between rows of healthy grapevines while her father laughed nearby. She remembered summer sunsets, the smell of earth, the distant mountains glowing gold beneath evening light. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt something. Not grief, not sadness, something deeper. A quiet pull, almost as if the forgotten vineyard was calling her home. Michael signed another document. Jennifer reached for a pen. The division of the estate continued. Yet Eleanor barely heard the conversation anymore. Her eyes remained fixed on the vineyard papers. Everyone else saw a worthless piece of land. Everyone else saw failure. But somewhere deep inside, she could not shake the feeling that her father had never truly abandoned that place. When the meeting finally ended, Eleanor calmly picked up the final folder. "I'll take the vineyard." Neither Michael nor Jennifer objected. In fact, both seemed relieved. Outside, the autumn wind continued sweeping across Montana. And far beyond the mountains, waiting beneath decades of neglect, Dead Hill Vineyard remained silent. For now. But Eleanor had no way of knowing that the forgotten land everyone else had rejected was about to change her life forever. A cold autumn rain drifted across the western Montana hills as gray clouds settled low above the abandoned vineyard and wind rattled the bare branches surrounding the old farmhouse. 3 days after leaving the lake house behind, Eleanor Brooks arrived at Dead Hill Vineyard with everything she still owned packed inside an aging SUV. The journey felt strangely symbolic. Nearly 50 years of marriage, family memories, and financial security now belonged to the past. Ahead of her stood a weathered wooden farmhouse that seemed forgotten by time itself. The house looked worse than she remembered. Several roof shingles were missing. The paint had peeled from the walls. Tall weeds surrounded the porch. One window had been boarded shut years earlier. The power lines still connected to the property, but electricity worked only intermittently. Internet service had never been installed. The nearest neighbor lived nearly 5 miles away. For most people, the place would have felt lonely. For Eleanor, it felt familiar. As she stepped onto the porch, memories flooded back. She remembered running across these same wooden boards as a child. She remembered summer evenings sitting beside her father Samuel Carter while he watched the sunset over the vineyard. Back then, the hills had been covered with healthy vines stretching toward the horizon. Now only twisted remnants remained. That first night proved difficult. The old furnace barely worked. Wind whistled through tiny gaps in the walls. The silence felt enormous. Several times Eleanor woke expecting to hear Robert's breathing beside her. Each time she remembered he was gone. The realization hurt no less than it had 3 weeks earlier. The following morning she began cleaning. The work gave her something to focus on. Room by room, she removed dust, discarded broken furniture, and organized forgotten belongings. Most of the objects dated back decades. Old farm equipment manuals, faded photographs, receipts from businesses that no longer existed. Then she discovered a locked storage room beneath the staircase. The key remained hanging from a hook nearby. Inside she found dozens of boxes. Most contained ordinary household items. One box immediately caught her attention. Across the lid, written in Samuel Carter's unmistakable handwriting, appeared a single word. Personal. Her pulse quickened. Samuel Carter had been a complicated man. He stood over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and strong even into old age. His thick dark hair had turned silver early, and his stern expression often intimidated strangers. Yet beneath that tough exterior existed deep loyalty and fierce love for his family. Growing up during difficult economic times had taught him caution. He trusted very few people and rarely discussed his past. Even Eleanor realized now how little she truly knew about him. She carried the box into the kitchen. Inside rested several leather-bound journals. Some appeared more than 40 years old. The pages smelled of age and cedar. That evening she lit an oil lamp when the electricity failed again and began reading. The earliest entries described vineyard operations, crop yields, weather patterns, equipment maintenance. Nothing unusual. Then the tone gradually changed. Several entries referred to something simply called the reserve. Others mentioned the promise. Again and again, Samuel used vague language. Never enough to explain anything. Only enough to raise questions. One entry particularly captured her attention. June 14, 1987. The secret remains safe. Some truths must stay buried until the right person finds them. Eleanor read the sentence 3 times. Buried? What secret? The next journal contained similar references. September 2nd, 1991. If they ever discover what lies beneath the hill, everything changes. Her heartbeat accelerated. The hill. Which hill? Dead Hill Vineyard covered 80 acres. Several hills overlooked the property. The statement could mean anything, or nothing. Yet Samuel repeated these mysterious comments dozens of times throughout multiple journals. Near midnight, Eleanor opened the final notebook. Unlike the others, this one had been written shortly before Samuel's death. His handwriting appeared shakier, weaker, but the words remained clear. If Eleanor ever returns here, she deserves the truth. Eleanor froze. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The room suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, as though her father were somehow speaking directly to her across time. She continued reading. The next page contained only one sentence. The answers begin beneath the cellar. Nothing more. No explanation. No directions. No clues. Only those 5 words. Eleanor slowly lowered the journal. Outside, darkness covered the vineyard. Wind moved through the dead vines. For a long moment, she sat motionless, staring toward the floor. The cellar. Beneath the house. The place she had not yet cleaned. The place she had barely entered. For the first time since arriving at Dead Hill Vineyard, something stronger than grief stirred inside her. Curiosity. Whatever secret Samuel Carter had protected for decades was still here, waiting. And somewhere beneath the old farmhouse, the first piece of that mystery was about to reveal itself. A cold wind swept across Dead Hill Vineyard as dark clouds drifted over the Montana mountains, and the last golden leaves of autumn tumbled across the abandoned rows of vines. For the next several days, Eleanor Brooks could think of little else besides the sentence she had discovered in her father's journal. The answers begin beneath the cellar. Every morning she reread the page while drinking coffee beside the kitchen window. Every evening, she found herself staring toward the old wine cellar located beneath the farmhouse. Finally, curiosity overcame hesitation. Armed with a flashlight, work gloves, and determination, Eleanor descended the narrow wooden staircase leading into the cellar. The room smelled of damp earth, aging wood, and forgotten history. Dust covered everything. Broken wine racks leaned against stone walls. Empty bottles lay scattered across the floor. Most people would have seen nothing more than an abandoned storage space. But Eleanor knew her father too well. Samuel Carter had never wasted words. If he had pointed her toward the cellar, there had to be a reason. For hours she searched every corner. Nothing. No hidden compartments. No secret doors. No clues. Frustration slowly replaced excitement. Then, while moving an old wine rack near the rear wall, she noticed something strange. One section of brickwork looked newer than the surrounding stone. The color differed slightly. The mortar appeared smoother. Most importantly, when she tapped the wall with a metal tool, the sound echoed differently. Hollow. Eleanor's heart began racing. She struck the wall again. The hollow sound remained. Something was hidden behind it. The problem was obvious. At 72 years old, she lacked both the strength and equipment necessary to tear down a reinforced brick wall. The following morning she drove into the nearest town, hoping to find help. That was when she met Jack Turner. Jack Turner was 68 years old, a retired firefighter who lived alone on a small ranch several miles from the vineyard. He stood 6 feet tall with a broad chest, powerful arms, and a face deeply lined by years of hard work and emergency service. His thick white beard covered much of his weathered jawline, while sharp brown eyes carried a calm confidence that came from spending decades running toward danger when everyone else ran away. 20 years earlier, Jack had survived a warehouse collapse during a major fire. The accident left a permanent scar running across his left cheek and forced him into early retirement. Since then, he spent most of his time repairing equipment, helping neighbors, and quietly avoiding attention. Despite his intimidating appearance, he possessed one of the kindest hearts Eleanor had ever encountered. When she explained the situation, Jack listened carefully. Most people would have laughed. Jack did not. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You found a hidden wall in a cellar connected to an abandoned vineyard?" Eleanor nodded. "That's right." Jack grinned. "Well, that sounds a lot more interesting than fixing fence posts." 2 days later, they returned to the vineyard carrying tools. The work proved difficult. The wall was thicker than expected. Several layers of brick had been added over time. Dust filled the cellar as pieces of masonry gradually fell away. Hour after hour they worked. Finally, late in the afternoon, Jack's sledgehammer broke through the final section. Both immediately froze. A cold draft emerged from the opening. Air. Fresh air. From somewhere beyond the wall. Jack widened the gap carefully. Then Eleanor shined her flashlight through the opening. Neither spoke. Beyond the wall stretched a narrow stone tunnel. The passage disappeared into darkness. Its arched ceiling suggested skilled craftsmanship. The stonework looked decades old, possibly older. Eleanor's pulse thundered inside her chest. Her father had hidden an entire tunnel beneath the vineyard. The next morning they returned with additional flashlights, batteries, and safety equipment. Step by step, they entered the passage. The tunnel continued far beyond anything they expected. 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet. The further they walked, the cooler the air became. Water dripped occasionally from the ceiling. Dust covered the floor. No footprints appeared anywhere. Whatever existed down here had remained untouched for decades. After nearly 15 minutes of walking, the tunnel finally ended. Both beams of light stopped on the same object. A massive steel door. The door stood nearly 8 feet tall and looked more like the entrance to a bank vault than something hidden beneath a vineyard. Its surface was covered with rust, but the structure remained intact. Heavy steel hinges. A reinforced locking mechanism. No visible handle. No obvious way inside. Eleanor stepped forward slowly. Her hand touched the cold metal. For a long moment, she simply stood there. Her father had spent years protecting whatever lay beyond this door. Perhaps an entire lifetime. Jack broke the silence. What do you think is inside? Eleanor stared at the vault-like entrance. She honestly had no idea. Money. Documents. Family secrets. Something else entirely. But one thing was certain. The mystery Samuel Carter had buried beneath Dead Hill Vineyard was real. And after decades of silence, they were standing only a few feet away from the truth. A cold mist drifted across the Montana hills as dawn broke over Dead Hill Vineyard, casting pale silver light across the abandoned rows of vines and the forgotten land that had guarded its secrets for generations. Eleanor Brooks barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the massive steel door waiting at the end of the tunnel. The mystery that had consumed her thoughts for weeks now stood only a few feet away. By sunrise, she and Jack Turner were already back inside the underground passage carrying lanterns, tools, and enough supplies to spend the entire day below ground. The steel door appeared even larger in the morning light. Years of rust covered its surface, yet the structure remained remarkably solid. Samuel Carter had clearly intended for whatever lay behind it to remain protected. For a long time, Jack examined the locking mechanism carefully. Whoever built this wasn't hiding a few old tools, he muttered. Eleanor nodded. Neither of them expected what happened next. While searching the frame, Eleanor noticed a small metal box hidden behind loose stonework. Inside rested a brass key. Attached to it was a faded note written in Samuel's handwriting. If you're reading this, you've earned the right to know. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. Slowly, she inserted the key. The mechanism resisted at first. Then a loud metallic click echoed through the tunnel. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the underground silence. Together they pushed. The heavy door groaned open. Cold air rushed from the chamber beyond. Neither moved for several seconds. Then Jack lifted his lantern. The light spilled into the room, and both stood frozen. Rows. Endless rows. Wooden racks stretched across the enormous underground chamber. Thousands of dark glass bottles rested inside them. Shelf after shelf disappeared into the shadows. The chamber was far larger than either had imagined. It looked less like a storage room and more like a hidden cathedral built for wine. Eleanor walked forward slowly. Many bottles carried labels dating back to the 1950s. Others bore Samuel Carter's signature. Some appeared untouched since the day they were placed there. Everything remained perfectly preserved. The cool underground temperature had protected them for decades. Jack stared in disbelief. My God! Eleanor could barely speak. Near the center of the room stood an old wooden desk. Several journals rested on top. Alongside them sat a sealed envelope bearing Eleanor's name. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter inside had been written by Samuel during the final years of his life. As she read, the truth finally emerged. Long before Eleanor was born, Samuel Carter had become one of the most respected independent winemakers in the American West. Though few people knew his name publicly, collectors and distributors throughout California, Oregon, Washington, and Montana sought his handcrafted wines. His small vineyard produced exceptional quality. Demand grew rapidly. Success followed. Then came betrayal. Samuel's business partner had been a man named Victor Langford. Victor Langford was described in the journals as a charismatic entrepreneur with dark hair, sharp features, and an easy smile that made people trust him quickly. He possessed extraordinary business instincts, but lacked Samuel's integrity. Wealth mattered more than loyalty. Profit mattered more than friendship. For years they worked together. Then Victor attempted to seize ownership of Samuel's wine formulas, production methods, and distribution contracts. Legal battles followed. Threats appeared. Several storage facilities connected to Samuel were mysteriously vandalized. One even burned under suspicious circumstances. Samuel became convinced that everything he had built could be stolen. Rather than surrender, he chose another path. Using trusted workers and family members, he secretly constructed the tunnel, an underground vault beneath the vineyard. Night after night, they moved inventory underground, bottle by bottle, year after year. When the final shipment disappeared beneath the hill, Samuel walked away from commercial wine production entirely. The public believed the vineyard failed. The truth remained hidden. For over 40 years, Eleanor lowered the letter slowly. Tears filled her eyes. Her father had sacrificed his life's work to protect his family, not because he feared poverty, because he feared greed. Beside the letter rested detailed inventory records. More than 4,000 bottles remained. Every one sealed. Every one authenticated. Every one preserved. The collection represented decades of craftsmanship, and perhaps much more. As Eleanor continued exploring, she noticed something else. Samuel had left notes beside many of the racks. Personal memories. Stories about her childhood. Stories about her mother. Stories about family celebrations. The vault was not merely a hiding place. It was a time capsule, a record of an entire life. Hours passed before Eleanor and Jack finally emerged from the tunnel. Neither spoke much during the drive back to the farmhouse. The discovery felt too large to process. As the sun set beyond the mountains, Eleanor stood alone on the porch overlooking the vineyard. For years, everyone had called this place dead, forgotten, worthless. Yet beneath those hills rested one of the greatest secrets in Montana wine history. And deep inside, Eleanor knew this discovery was only the beginning. Because somewhere among 4,000 bottles and decades of hidden history, her father's final legacy was waiting to change everything. A pale winter sun rose over the Montana mountains as frost covered the abandoned vineyard, turning the dead vines silver beneath a sky as clear and cold as crystal. For nearly a week after discovering the hidden vault, Eleanor Brooks and Jack Turner told no one. Not Michael, not Jennifer, not a single neighbor. The secret felt too large, too unbelievable. Each day they carefully inventoried the bottles resting inside Samuel Carter's underground chamber. Some labels had faded with time. Others remained pristine. Every rack seemed to contain another forgotten piece of history. The more they documented, the more extraordinary the discovery became. Yet neither Eleanor nor Jack possessed the expertise necessary to determine its true value. Eventually, they agreed there was only one responsible option: professional authentication. 3 weeks later, a black SUV from California rolled slowly up the long gravel road leading to Dead Hill Vineyard. The first visitor was Dr. Vincent Navarro. At 61 years old, Vincent had become one of the most respected wine historians and appraisers in North America. He was a tall, slender man with olive skin, silver hair brushed neatly backward, and intelligent dark eyes that missed very little. A neatly trimmed gray beard framed his narrow face. After spending 30 years evaluating rare wine collections across Europe and the United States, Vincent had earned a reputation for caution. He rarely became excited, which made his reaction particularly memorable. Accompanying him was Claire Morgan, a 43-year-old wine preservation specialist from Napa Valley. Claire stood nearly 6 feet tall, with long auburn hair tied into a practical ponytail and sharp green eyes that reflected both intelligence and confidence. Years of restoring damaged historical wine collections had made her exceptionally detail-oriented. She trusted evidence more than speculation and often challenged assumptions before accepting conclusions. When Eleanor first led them through the tunnel, both experts remained professionally calm. At first, then they entered the vault. Silence followed. Vincent slowly removed his glasses. Claire stopped walking entirely. For nearly a full minute, neither spoke. Thousands of bottles surrounded them. Perfect rows. Perfect preservation. Decades untouched. Finally, Vincent whispered 3 words. "This can't be real." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Jack. The experts immediately began working. Hour after hour they inspected labels, corks, storage conditions, production records, and Samuel's journals. Every new discovery increased their astonishment. Many of the wines represented limited productions that had vanished from public records generations earlier. Some vintages were believed completely lost. Others existed only in historical references. The underground chamber had preserved them all. By the 3rd day, the initial findings became impossible to ignore. Claire sat quietly at Samuel's old desk reviewing documentation. Then she looked directly at Eleanor. "Do you understand what your father did?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not entirely." Claire exhaled slowly. "He didn't just save wine." She gestured toward the racks. "He preserved a piece of American winemaking history." The final valuation process required another week. When the report was finished, Vincent personally delivered the results. The 4 gathered inside the farmhouse kitchen. Snow drifted gently outside the windows. Vincent placed the folder on the table. For several moments, nobody opened it. Finally, Eleanor looked down. The estimated value nearly stopped her heart. $25 million. Conservative estimate. Potentially much higher. Some individual bottles carried values exceeding $50,000 each. Several collections were considered historically significant. Others would likely trigger bidding wars among wealthy collectors. Jack stared at the numbers. "Eleanor." His voice faded. Even he couldn't find words. Eleanor sat motionless. Throughout her life, she had never cared much about wealth. Robert handled most financial matters. Her father rarely discussed money. Yet now she was staring at a fortune hidden beneath the very land everyone considered worthless. Suddenly, another memory returned. She was 12 years old, helping Samuel repair a fence near the vineyard. At the time, she had asked why he worked so hard protecting old things. Samuel smiled and replied with words she never fully understood. "Some treasures only survive when they're buried deeper than greed can reach." Back then she assumed he meant family values. Now she understood. He had been speaking literally, and perhaps spiritually. The vault had never existed merely to preserve wine. It existed to protect something from human greed. The irony struck her hard. Michael and Jennifer had eagerly taken everything they believed held value. The house, the investments, the company assets. Meanwhile, they willingly abandoned the one property containing the greatest treasure of all. That evening, after the experts departed, Eleanor walked alone through the vineyard. Snow crunched beneath her boots. The mountains glowed pink beneath the setting sun. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt neither grief nor uncertainty, only understanding. Samuel Carter had spent decades protecting this secret, not because he wanted wealth, because he wanted the right person to find it. And standing beneath the winter sky, Eleanor finally understood exactly what her father meant when he said some things must be buried deeply to remain safe. A gray spring rain drifted across the Montana hills as low clouds wrapped themselves around the mountains surrounding Dead Hill Vineyard, turning the landscape into a world of mist and silence. For nearly a month after the appraisal, Eleanor Brooks lived much as she always had. She repaired sections of the farmhouse. She worked alongside Jack Turner restoring portions of the vineyard. She read more of Samuel Carter's journals every evening. And she told almost nobody about the hidden collection. Unfortunately, secrets of that size rarely remained hidden forever. The first rumors appeared in local newspapers. A brief article mentioned the discovery of a historic wine collection beneath an abandoned Montana vineyard. A week later, another publication estimated the collection might be worth tens of millions of dollars. Then came television coverage. By the time national wine magazines began discussing the discovery, the story had spread far beyond Montana. Eleanor disliked the attention. The publicity felt uncomfortable. The vineyard had become quiet again after Robert's death. Now reporters occasionally parked outside the property gates. Collectors called constantly. Investors sent letters. Everyone suddenly seemed interested in Dead Hill Vineyard. And eventually, the news reached Michael and Jennifer. The phone call arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Eleanor recognized her son's number immediately. Michael Brooks had not contacted her in almost 8 months. At 50 years old, Michael remained handsome in a polished, corporate sort of way. He stood nearly 6 feet tall with dark hair beginning to gray around the temples and a carefully maintained appearance that reflected years spent managing investment firms in Seattle. He was intelligent, ambitious, and persuasive. Unfortunately, success had slowly taught him to evaluate situations through the lens of financial opportunity. "Mom," he said warmly. The enthusiasm sounded unusual, almost rehearsed. Eleanor smiled politely. "Hello, Michael." For 20 minutes, he spoke about family, her health, the weather, memories of childhood, questions he had never asked during the previous 8 months. When the conversation ended, Eleanor sat quietly. Something felt wrong. 3 days later, Jennifer called. Jennifer Brooks, 47 years old, possessed many of Eleanor's physical features. She had shoulder-length blonde hair, elegant posture, and bright blue eyes that could appear either warm or calculating depending on the situation. After years working in luxury real estate in Denver, she had become exceptionally skilled at reading people and presenting herself exactly as circumstances required. Like her brother, she suddenly seemed eager to reconnect. She asked about Eleanor's health, the farmhouse, the vineyard, then casually asked whether the stories about valuable wine were true. The question arrived so naturally that many parents might have missed it. Eleanor did not. For the first time, a small feeling of disappointment stirred inside her. 2 weeks later, both children arrived unexpectedly. Separate vehicles. Same afternoon. The timing alone revealed more than either realized. The reunion initially appeared pleasant. Michael brought expensive flowers. Jennifer arrived carrying homemade pastries. They complimented the farmhouse, praised the restoration work, expressed concern about Eleanor living alone. Jack Turner happened to be repairing fencing nearby when they arrived. From a distance, he quietly observed the interaction. Years as a firefighter had taught him something useful. People often revealed themselves through what they asked, not what they said. For the first several hours, everything remained cordial. Then the questions began. How many bottles were discovered? Had collectors made offers? Was the collection insured? Who controlled ownership rights? Had attorneys become involved? The conversation gradually shifted from family to assets, from concern to valuation, from love to numbers. That evening, after dinner, Michael finally asked the question he truly wanted answered. "So what happens if you decide to sell everything?" Silence filled the room. Eleanor slowly lowered her coffee cup. Jennifer immediately joined the discussion. "There must be estate planning considerations." Michael nodded. "We only want to help." The words sounded reasonable, yet something inside Eleanor changed. Not anger, not resentment, recognition. For months after Robert's funeral, neither child had shown interest in visiting. Neither asked whether she was lonely. Neither offered help restoring the property everyone considered worthless. Now they traveled hundreds of miles the moment wealth appeared. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Later that night, Eleanor sat alone on the porch. Rain tapped softly against the roof. The vineyard stretched into darkness beyond the yard. She thought about Samuel Carter. She thought about Robert. And she thought about how quickly money revealed people's priorities. The following morning, Michael presented several investment proposals. Jennifer suggested legal restructuring options. Both spoke enthusiastically about protecting family wealth. Neither mentioned preserving Samuel's legacy. Neither mentioned restoring the vineyard. Neither mentioned the community. When they finally left that afternoon, Eleanor felt strangely calm. The visit had answered questions she never intended to ask. For years, she believed losing the inheritance revealed her children's priorities. Now she realized finding the hidden fortune revealed them even more clearly. And standing beside the old vineyard gate as their vehicles disappeared down the road, Eleanor understood something important. The greatest challenge ahead would not be protecting the wine collection. It would be protecting her father's legacy from the very people who suddenly wanted a piece of it. A cold spring rain swept across Missoula County as dark clouds rolled over the Montana mountains, covering Dead Hill Vineyard beneath a blanket of gray skies and restless wind. The weeks following Michael and Jennifer's visit became increasingly tense. At first, Eleanor Brooks hoped her children would reconsider their behavior. She hoped the conversations about money were temporary. She hoped they simply needed time. Instead, the situation worsened. Phone calls became more frequent. Emails arrived almost daily. Michael repeatedly suggested restructuring ownership of the vineyard and the wine collection. Jennifer encouraged her mother to create shared control agreements. Every proposal pointed toward the same destination: control. Eleanor politely declined every suggestion. That refusal only intensified their determination. Then the official legal documents arrived. The envelope appeared in Eleanor's mailbox on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She immediately recognized the law firm's name. As she opened the paperwork, her stomach tightened. Michael had filed a petition with the district court. His request shocked even Jack Turner. The petition claimed Eleanor lacked the mental capacity necessary to manage a multi-million-dollar estate. Michael sought appointment as her financial guardian. If successful, he would gain authority over the vineyard, the wine collection, and every major financial decision. Jack read the documents twice. His face darkened. He actually filed this. Eleanor nodded slowly. The sadness hurt far more than the anger, because beneath the legal language stood an uncomfortable truth. Her own son was attempting to take control of her life. Several days later, Eleanor contacted an attorney recommended by Richard Lawson. Her name was Abigail Foster. Abigail Foster was 55 years old, a respected estate litigation attorney from Helena. She stood slightly above average height, with short silver blonde hair, sharp gray eyes, and a composed confidence developed through 30 years of courtroom battles. Unlike many aggressive litigators, Abigail preferred preparation over theatrics. Years earlier, she had cared for her own aging mother during a lengthy illness, an experience that left her deeply sensitive toward cases involving elderly individuals being unfairly portrayed as incapable. After reviewing the documents, Abigail remained silent for several moments. Then she looked directly at Eleanor. "Do you have records?" Eleanor smiled. More than he realizes. Over the next month, they assembled evidence. Every journal Samuel Carter had left behind. Every deed. Every property transfer. Every ownership document. Every appraisal report. Every financial statement. Every vineyard restoration plan. Most importantly, they gathered proof that Eleanor personally managed the discovery, preservation, and valuation of the collection. The evidence painted a very different picture from the one Michael described. Not incompetence. Competence. Not confusion. Leadership. As the hearing approached, local rumors spread rapidly. Many residents could not believe Michael had taken legal action against his own mother. Others assumed the enormous value of the collection explained everything. Money often changed people. Sometimes it revealed who they already were. The courtroom filled quickly on the morning of the hearing. Eleanor sat quietly beside Abigail Foster. Across the room sat Michael and his legal team. Jennifer attended as well, though she appeared increasingly uncomfortable with how far events had progressed. For the first time since the conflict began, uncertainty showed on her face. The hearing began promptly. Michael's attorney argued that Eleanor's advanced age created risks for managing such a valuable estate. He attempted to portray her decisions as impulsive and emotionally driven. Then Abigail stood. The atmosphere immediately shifted. One by one, she introduced evidence. Samuel's journals, the authenticated ownership records, the original inheritance documents, the vineyard restoration plans, the wine collection inventory, the financial reports. Each document demonstrated Eleanor's active involvement. Each document contradicted Michael's claims. Then came the final moment. Abigail presented months of correspondence, contracts, and negotiations personally conducted by Eleanor herself. The judge reviewed them carefully. Questions followed. Eleanor answered everyone calmly, clearly, precisely. For nearly an hour, she discussed vineyard operations, asset preservation, collection management, and future planning. The courtroom listened in silence. The image Michael attempted to create simply did not exist. Finally, the judge removed his glasses. His expression carried visible irritation. The court finds absolutely no evidence of incapacity. Silence filled the room. The judge continued. The petition is dismissed immediately. A murmur spread through the audience. Michael lowered his eyes. His entire strategy had collapsed. Months of legal maneuvering ended within minutes. Eleanor felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, only sadness, because despite winning, she had lost something else. The illusion that her son valued her more than her wealth. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited for comments. Eleanor declined every interview. Instead, She walked slowly toward her vehicle. Jack waited beside the truck. "So," he asked gently, "how do you feel?" Eleanor looked toward the distant mountains. The rain had finally stopped. A narrow beam of sunlight broke through the clouds. "I think my father prepared me for this long before I realized it." Jack smiled. She smiled back. For the first time since the conflict began, Eleanor understood something important. Samuel Carter had not hidden the collection to protect it from strangers. He had hidden it from greed. And today, that lesson had proven itself once again. A warm summer breeze moved through the Montana valleys as sunlight washed over the rolling hills surrounding Dead Hill Vineyard, bringing life back to the land that had once been called dead. The court case was over. Michael's petition had failed. The wine collection remained protected. For the first time in many months, Eleanor Brooks could have chosen an easy path. She could have sold the entire collection. She could have moved into luxury. She could have spent the rest of her life enjoying the fortune hidden beneath the vineyard. Many people expected exactly that. Instead, she surprised everyone, especially herself. One evening, while reviewing Samuel Carter's journals, Eleanor found a passage she had somehow overlooked before. The entry had been written shortly after Samuel's own father lost several friends to financial exploitation during their later years. The words were simple. "The greatest danger facing many old people is not poverty. It is abandonment." Eleanor stared at the sentence for a long time. Memories surfaced immediately. The loneliness she experienced after Robert's death. The months when neither Michael nor Jennifer called. The courtroom. The legal filings. The realization that wealth had attracted people who ignored her when she needed them most. Suddenly, a new purpose began forming. A purpose larger than the vineyard. Larger than the wine collection. Larger than the fortune itself. Several weeks later, Eleanor called a meeting at the farmhouse. Jack Turner attended. Abigail Foster attended. Even Dr. Vincent Navarro joined through a video conference. Eleanor explained her idea. The room fell silent. Then Jack smiled. That's exactly what Samuel would have done. The plan moved quickly. A portion of the wine collection was carefully sold through private auctions and specialty collectors. The sales generated millions of dollars, far more than Eleanor personally needed. Rather than keep the wealth, she directed much of it toward a new organization. The Samuel Carter Hope Center. The center would serve elderly individuals abandoned by family members, manipulated by financial predators, or left vulnerable during the final chapters of their lives. The mission reflected everything Samuel Carter believed. Protection, dignity, second chances. Within months, construction began on a renovated property near Missoula. The building itself had once been an abandoned rehabilitation center. Now it received a second life. So did the people who would eventually walk through its doors. One of the first employees hired was Margaret Ellis. Margaret Ellis was 60 years old, tall and slender with short silver hair, gentle brown eyes, and a calm voice that instantly put people at ease. For over 30 years, she worked as a social worker throughout Montana, helping vulnerable seniors navigate abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation. The death of her own grandmother, who lost her savings to a fraudulent caregiver years earlier, inspired Margaret's lifelong dedication to protecting older adults. She immediately embraced Eleanor's vision. Together, they built programs providing legal assistance, financial counseling, temporary housing, and emotional support. The first residents arrived only weeks after opening. One of them was Henry Dawson. Henry was 83 years old, thin and slightly stooped, with white hair and trembling hands shaped by decades of ranch work. After suffering a minor stroke, he trusted a distant relative to help manage his finances. Instead, the relative emptied his accounts and disappeared. Henry nearly lost everything. At the Hope Center, he found attorneys willing to help. More importantly, he found people who listened. Another resident was Rose Martinez. Rose, 78 years old, possessed soft gray curls and kind dark eyes. After her husband's death, she signed documents she did not fully understand. And scrupulous individuals nearly convinced her to surrender ownership of her home. The Hope Center intervened before the transaction became permanent. Stories like theirs multiplied, month after month, case after case. Hundreds of elderly individuals began seeking help. Some needed legal protection. Some needed housing. Many simply needed someone who cared. Local newspapers started covering the center's success. Volunteers arrived. Donations followed. Attorneys donated services. Retired counselors offered support. Medical professionals volunteered time. The mission expanded faster than anyone expected. One afternoon, Eleanor walked through the facility watching residents share lunch together. Laughter echoed through the dining room. Friendships formed. Lives slowly rebuilt. For a moment she thought about Michael. Then Jennifer. Surprisingly, she felt no bitterness. The court case could have turned her heart toward revenge. Instead, it had pointed her toward purpose. That evening, she stood outside the center watching the sunset paint the Montana sky orange and gold. Jack joined her. "You know," he said softly, "most people would have spent the money on themselves." Eleanor smiled. "My father buried the collection to protect people from greed." She looked back at the building. "I think he'd want it protecting people still." Inside, dozens of elderly residents continued talking, laughing, and planning for the future. Lives that once seemed forgotten were finding hope again. And as darkness settled across Montana, Eleanor realized the greatest treasure hidden beneath Dead Hill Vineyard had never been the wine. It was the opportunity to change lives. A gentle autumn breeze moved through the vineyard as golden sunlight spilled across the hills of western Montana, painting the rows of grapevines in shades of amber, crimson, and gold. Almost a year had passed since the opening of the Samuel Carter Hope Center. The organization had grown beyond anything Eleanor Brooks originally imagined. Hundreds of elderly individuals had received assistance. Dozens of families had been reunited. Volunteers arrived from across Montana. The vineyard itself had become a symbol of second chances. Yet one wound remained unhealed. Her family. Eleanor rarely spoke about Michael anymore. The court case had created a distance neither knew how to cross. Jennifer, however, occupied her thoughts more often. Not because of what Jennifer had done, because of what she had not done. Unlike Michael, Jennifer never pushed the lawsuit. She never testified against her mother. She followed her brother's lead, but somewhere along the way, uncertainty had begun appearing in her eyes. Eleanor noticed it. Others noticed it too. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Denver, Jennifer Brooks was struggling with something she could no longer ignore. At 47, she still maintained the polished image that had defined most of her adult life. Her blonde hair remained perfectly styled. Her designer clothing reflected years of success in luxury real estate. Clients trusted her confidence. Colleagues admired her professionalism. But privately, she was changing. The change began shortly after reading a newspaper article about the Hope Center. Then another. Then another. Each story described lives transformed because of Eleanor's work. A widow saved from financial abuse. A veteran reunited with family. An elderly couple protected from fraud. Again and again, Jennifer saw her mother's name attached to compassion rather than bitterness. The realization haunted her. After everything that happened, Eleanor could have spent her energy fighting. Instead, she chose healing. One evening, Jennifer sat alone in her condominium overlooking downtown Denver. An old family photo rested on her coffee table. She was 10 years old, standing beside Eleanor and Robert during a summer picnic. All three were smiling. The memory hurt, because for the first time, Jennifer saw herself honestly. She had spent years pursuing success, years chasing commissions, promotions, and financial security. Somewhere along the way, she slowly stopped showing up for the people who mattered most. The court case forced her to confront that truth. Not Michael, herself. 3 days later, she packed a suitcase. The drive to Montana felt longer than ever before. Not because of distance, because of uncertainty. She had no idea whether her mother wanted to see her. No idea whether forgiveness was even possible. When Jennifer finally arrived at Dead Hill Vineyard, the sun was beginning to set. The vineyard looked beautiful. Healthy vines stretched across the hills. The farmhouse stood stronger than it had in decades. Life had returned to the property. Eleanor sat on the front porch reading one of Samuel Carter's journals. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Jennifer suddenly felt like a frightened child again. Then she stepped forward. "Mom." Eleanor looked up. 100 different responses could have followed. Instead, she smiled softly. "Hello, Jennifer." The kindness almost broke her. Tears filled Jennifer's eyes immediately. For the next hour, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset spread across the mountains. Neither rushed the conversation. Neither hid behind excuses. Eventually, Jennifer spoke. "I was wrong." The words came quietly. "Honestly, I cared more about money than people." She stared toward the vineyard. "I convinced myself I was helping. But really, I was afraid. Eleanor listened silently. Jennifer continued. I spent years measuring everything by success, and somehow I stopped seeing what actually mattered. The confession left her exhausted. For a long moment, only the wind moved through the vines. Then Eleanor reached over and gently took her daughter's hand. The simple gesture felt more powerful than any speech. We all make mistakes, Eleanor said softly. Jennifer lowered her head. Can you forgive me? The question hung in the air. The mountains glowed orange beneath the setting sun. Eleanor thought about Samuel, about Robert, about the Hope Center, about all the people she encouraged to seek healing instead of bitterness. Then she smiled. I already have. Jennifer began crying openly, not because the pain disappeared, because grace had arrived where she expected judgment. As darkness slowly settled across the vineyard, mother and daughter remained on the porch talking. They shared memories of Robert, stories from childhood, regrets, dreams. For the first time in years, they spoke honestly. Nothing was magically fixed. Years of distance could not disappear in a single evening. But something important had begun. Trust. As the last sunlight faded beyond the Montana hills, Eleanor looked across the vineyard Samuel Carter had protected for so many years. The collection saved lives. The Hope Center restored hope. And now, perhaps, the vineyard was doing something else. Bringing a family home, one heart at a time. A warm September sunset spread across the mountains of western Montana as golden light rolled over the vineyards surrounding Dead Hill Vineyard, painting the landscape with the colors of peace and harvest. 8 years had passed since Eleanor Brooks first walked into the abandoned vineyard carrying little more than grief, uncertainty, and a handful of dollars. The world around her had changed dramatically since then. The Samuel Carter Hope Center had become one of the most respected charitable organizations in Montana. What began as a small project helping vulnerable seniors had expanded into something far larger. New satellite offices operated throughout Missoula County. Legal aid programs protected elderly victims of fraud. Housing initiatives assisted seniors abandoned by family members. Counseling services helped countless people rebuild their lives after loss and betrayal. Every year, hundreds of individuals passed through the doors of the organization. Many arrived feeling forgotten. Most left feeling valued again. The center's success attracted attention throughout the region. Universities studied its model. Nonprofit organizations requested guidance. State officials publicly praised its impact. Yet Eleanor never allowed the mission to become about recognition. At 80 years old, she remained the same woman who once sat alone inside a crumbling farmhouse wondering what to do with her future. Her silver hair had grown thinner. The lines on her face had deepened. But her blue-gray eyes still carried quiet determination. More importantly, they carried peace. One crisp autumn morning, Eleanor attended a gathering at the Hope Center. The event celebrated another successful year of service. Residents, volunteers, attorneys, social workers, and former clients filled the main hall. Many of them owed their second chance to the center. One woman stood out among the crowd. Her name was Linda Harper. Linda Harper was 76 years old, petite and soft-spoken, with short white hair and gentle green eyes. Several years earlier, after her husband's death, dishonest relatives manipulated her into signing documents that nearly stripped away her savings and home. The Hope Center intervened before the damage became permanent. Since then, Linda dedicated much of her time volunteering with newly arrived residents, helping them navigate the same fears she once faced. That afternoon, she approached Eleanor. You saved my life. Eleanor immediately shook her head. No. Linda smiled. You gave me a chance to save it myself. The exchange remained with Eleanor long after the event ended, because it captured something important. The Hope Center was never about rescuing people. It was about helping them rediscover their own strength. Meanwhile, the wine collection continued its gradual journey across the world. Each year, carefully selected bottles were sold to private collectors, museums, and prestigious auction houses. Some eventually appeared in France. Others traveled to Italy, Japan, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Wine historians continued discussing Samuel Carter's remarkable collection. The story became legendary among collectors. Yet Eleanor rarely thought about the money anymore. The fortune generated by the collection had long surpassed what she personally needed. Millions of dollars had flowed into programs helping others. The bottles themselves were simply a tool, a means to an end. One evening, Jennifer joined her mother at the vineyard. Their relationship had grown stronger over the years. Not perfect, but genuine. The healing that began on the porch years earlier continued slowly and honestly. Together, they walked between rows of healthy vines restored to life. The setting sun illuminated the mountains beyond. Jennifer glanced toward the valley. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Grandpa never hid the collection? Eleanor smiled. Sometimes. Jennifer waited. Eleanor looked toward the distant Hope Center visible across the valley. Then she answered, I don't think he hid it to make us rich. The words lingered, because deep inside, both women knew they were true. Later that week, Eleanor visited the original underground vault one final time. Most of the racks now stood partially empty. Thousands of bottles had already fulfilled their purpose. The chamber felt quieter, lighter, almost peaceful. At the center of the room remained Samuel Carter's old desk. Eleanor gently placed her hand upon it. For a long moment, memories flooded back. The journals, the tunnel, the courtroom, the vineyard, the Hope Center, the families restored, the lives changed, the loneliness transformed into purpose. As she emerged from the tunnel, the evening sun painted the Montana hills gold. Above the entrance to the Hope Center stood a bronze sign carrying her father's name, Samuel Carter Hope Center. Visitors passed beneath it every day. Some arrived frightened. Some arrived broken. Some arrived believing nobody cared. Many left believing otherwise. And every time Eleanor walked past that sign, she remembered the lesson Samuel Carter had spent a lifetime protecting. The treasure beneath the vineyard was never meant to enrich future generations. It was meant to serve them, not through wealth alone, through compassion, through dignity, through hope. Because in the end, the greatest value was never measured in millions of dollars. It was measured in people, the families reunited, the lonely comforted, the vulnerable protected, the lives restored. And as the final sunlight disappeared beyond the Montana mountains, Eleanor understood something her father had known all along. Some treasures are buried not to be hidden forever, but to be discovered at exactly the right time by exactly the right person, so they can change the lives of those who need them most. Sometimes, God's miracles do not arrive the way we imagine. They do not always come wrapped in wealth, success, or instant solutions. They do not always appear with flashing signs or dramatic moments that change everything overnight. Sometimes, God's miracles are hidden beneath years of hardship. Sometimes, they are buried beneath loss, disappointment, loneliness, and unanswered questions. And sometimes, just like the treasure beneath Samuel Carter's vineyard, God's greatest blessings remain hidden until the exact moment they are needed most. Eleanor believed she had lost everything when her children took the house, the accounts, and the life she once knew. But God saw a bigger picture. While others saw an abandoned vineyard, God saw a future filled with hope. While others saw forgotten land, God saw lives that would one day be restored. While others saw an old woman starting over, God saw someone who would change an entire community. Because through one hidden treasure, lonely seniors found friendship, families found healing, broken hearts found purpose, and people who felt forgotten discovered that they still mattered. In our everyday lives, many of us are facing our own abandoned vineyards. Maybe it is the loss of someone we love. Maybe it is a broken relationship. Maybe it is financial hardship, illness, loneliness, or a dream that seems impossible. And sometimes we wonder where God is in the middle of it all. But this story reminds us that God is often working beneath the surface long before we can see the results. The struggle you are facing today may be preparing a blessing for tomorrow. The prayer that seems unanswered may simply be unfolding in ways you cannot yet understand. The kindness you offer today may become the miracle someone else desperately needs. Never underestimate what God can do through a faithful heart. Never underestimate the power of forgiveness. And never underestimate how one person, trusting God one step at a time, can change countless lives. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from and what lesson this story meant to you. We would love to hear your story and your experience with faith, family, forgiveness, and second chances. And if you enjoy inspiring stories about hope, perseverance, family, and God's quiet miracles, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. May God bless you and your loved ones. May He strengthen you during difficult seasons, comfort you in moments of grief, Provide for your needs when life feels uncertain, and fill your heart with peace that surpasses understanding. And may you always remember this. With God, even the treasure buried deepest beneath life's hardships can become a blessing that changes generations.